I never thought I could fall in love again, especially after all these years of being married to Julia. We had built a life together, weathered both joys and sorrows, and supported each other through the darkest times. Julia wasn't just my wife. She was my closest friend, my partner in everything. But life is strange. It has a way of throwing us into unexpected turmoil just when we think we're safe. I can't pinpoint the exact moment when it all began. Alice had always been there, Julia's best friend, who was practically family to us. She was a regular presence at our home, joining us for dinners, weekend outings, and summer barbecues. Alice was so deeply woven into the fabric of our lives that I had never thought of her as anything more than a friend of the family. But something shifted recently, and it frightened me in ways I couldn't admit, even to myself. The change began to unfold one sunny afternoon during a picnic by the lake. Julia loved these days. Fresh air, laughter. The three of us sharing easy conversations under the open sky. We had brought a bottle of wine, a basket of snacks, and laid out a blanket beneath a large oak tree on the hill. Alice arrived a bit later, her usual radiant smile and carefree spirit instantly brightening the atmosphere. I remember sitting on the grass, listening to them laugh at one of Alice's jokes. But while Julia was laughing, I found myself captivated by Alice. There was something about the way her eyes sparkled, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she smiled. These were small things, details I had never noticed before. But now I couldn't stop noticing. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Julia excused herself to grab some extra blankets from the car, leaving me alone with Alice. We sat in companionable silence, watching the serene surface of the lake, the light turning a soft orange. In that quiet moment, I felt something shift between us, something that I couldn't quite put into words. Beautiful sunset, isn't it? Alice said softly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. Yes, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Her closeness was almost unbearable, and I felt my heart begin to race. We sat there, our hands resting on the blanket, so close they nearly touched. There was no physical contact, but the air between us felt charged. I closed my eyes, trying to suppress the feelings that were rising within me. This was wrong. I loved my wife, and whatever this was, it had to stop. I enjoy spending time with you both, Alice said suddenly, her voice soft, almost hesitant. We enjoy having you around too, I replied, though my voice sounded distant, even to myself. A tightness gripped my chest. I knew these feelings were a path to nowhere, but the more time I spent around her, the more drawn to her I became. That evening, as we drove home, Julia fell asleep in the passenger seat. But instead of thinking about her, my thoughts were consumed by Alice. How her eyes had lingered on mine by the lake, the softness of her voice when she spoke to me. Every day, my thoughts kept drifting back to her, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening between us. The next time we saw each other was at an art gallery where Julia was organizing a charity event. Alice was there, as always, supporting her friend. I tried to keep my distance, to avoid looking at her too long, but it was impossible. She was glowing with excitement, her eyes alight as she admired the paintings. And when our eyes met across the room, it was as if something in me broke. "Do you like this piece?" I asked, approaching her as she studied one of the paintings. "Yes," she said, a soft smile playing on her lips. "It reminds me of something I can't quite remember, like an old dream. Maybe it's something you've lost?" I said quietly, realizing that I wasn't just talking about her, but about myself as well. There was a moment of silence between us, but this time it was thick with tension. I could feel myself being pulled toward her, wanting to be closer than I should. But Julia was just a few steps away, chatting with guests, and the weight of her presence hung between us like an invisible wall. The rest of the evening was a blur. I mingled with the crowd, but I was hyper-aware of Alice's gaze following me. Every time our eyes met, it was like a silent conversation, one that was growing harder to ignore. I felt guilty, torn between the love I had for my wife and the growing attraction I couldn't control. That night was just the beginning. Every time we met, at dinners, during family outings, or even by chance encounters on the street, I felt my connection to Alice deepen. Each glance, every word exchanged, seemed to spark something I couldn't put out. It was like trying to hold back a tide that was slowly pulling me under. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was simply lonely, or bored, or anything that would make these feelings less real. But the truth was, I was falling for her. And with every day that passed, it became harder to ignore the way my heart skipped a beat whenever I saw her, or how I would catch her looking at me, her eyes filled with something I was too afraid to name. The worst part was that I could sense she felt it too. There were moments when she would look at me, her eyes softening, her smile faltering, as if she was just as conflicted as I was. But neither of us dared to speak of it, afraid of what acknowledging it would do. Then, one weekend, Julia suggested we all go on a short hiking trip. The idea was to escape the city, to relax, and to enjoy the beauty of nature. It was supposed to be a way for us to reconnect, but instead, it only intensified everything I was feeling. As we hiked through the forest, with Julia walking ahead of us, Alice and I fell behind. The path was narrow, the air filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. At one point, Alice stumbled on a loose rock, and I instinctively reached out to steady her, my hand on her arm, her soft gasp of surprise. These were small moments, but they sent shockwaves through me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was falling for the woman who was supposed to be nothing more than my wife's best friend. But I knew this was only the beginning, and that the road ahead would only get more difficult. I tried to forget that moment in the forest, the way her breath caught when I touched her, the way her eyes lingered on mine a little too long. But it was impossible. The more I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, the more I found myself thinking of her, her smile, the warmth in her voice, the way she seemed to understand me in ways that no one else did, not even Julia. But I couldn't let it show. I couldn't let Julia suspect that something had changed. So I forced myself to act normal, to focus on work and everyday routines. I tried to be the attentive husband, the loving partner that Julia deserved. But whenever we were all together, I could feel Alice's presence like a magnet pulling at me, even when I wasn't looking in her direction. It became a torturous dance. Every time Julia invited Alice over for dinner, every weekend barbecue or spontaneous brunch, I would find myself on edge, torn between wanting to be near her and desperately trying to hide how I felt. It was as if the air between us had become charged, a silent tension that no one else seemed to notice. But I noticed, and I could sense that Alice noticed too. One evening, Julia had organized a quiet dinner at our house, just the three of us. She loved playing hostess, setting the table beautifully, choosing the perfect wine. Alice arrived a bit later than usual, carrying a bouquet of flowers for Julia. I watched as they embraced, the easy affection between them making me feel like an intruder in my own home. As we sat down to eat, I tried to focus on the conversation, but my eyes kept drifting to Alice. She was radiant that night, her laughter filling the room, her eyes sparkling in the candlelight. I could see the way she looked at Julia, the genuine love and friendship they shared, and I hated myself for feeling what I did. How could I betray Julia like this, even in my thoughts? How could I risk everything we had built together? But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop the flutter in my chest whenever Alice's hand accidentally brushed mine as she reached for her glass. Each touch, however innocent, sent jolts through me. I was falling deeper into something I knew I shouldn't, and the guilt gnawed at me constantly. After dinner, Julia suggested we move to the living room for dessert. She brought out her famous tiramisu, which she knew was Alice's favorite. As they laughed and reminisced about old times, I found myself slipping away to the kitchen, needing a moment alone to gather myself. I leaned against the counter, trying to calm the storm inside me, when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I found Alice standing in the doorway, her expression uncertain. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft, almost tentative. "Yeah, I just needed a moment," I replied, trying to sound casual. But there was no hiding the tremor in my voice, the way my heart was pounding in my chest. She stepped closer, concern in her eyes. "Max, if something's bothering you, you can talk to me," she said, her gaze searching mine. "I'm worried about you." For a moment, I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to confess how confused I was, how much I hated myself for feeling this way about her, how every day was a struggle between what I knew was right and what my heart was screaming for. But I couldn't do that to her. I couldn't drag her into my mess of emotions. Instead, I forced a smile and shook my head. "I'm fine, really," I lied. "Just tired." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded, her eyes lingering on mine a moment longer before turning to leave. As she walked away, I wanted to reach out, to grab her hand, to pull her back. But instead, I just stood there, rooted to the spot, watching her disappear around the corner. The rest of the evening was a blur. Julia was in high spirits, telling stories and pouring more wine, but I was barely present. My mind kept replaying that moment in the kitchen, the look in Alice's eyes, the concern in her voice. Did she know? Did she suspect what was happening between us, even if neither of us had said it out loud? A week later, Julia planned a weekend getaway to a cabin by the lake, hoping to unwind before the busy holiday season. "Let's invite Alice," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "It'll be fun, just like old times." The last thing I needed was more time alone with Alice, but I couldn't find a way to say no. So we packed up the car, loaded it with food, drinks, and blankets, and drove to the cabin nestled deep in the woods. The air was crisp and cool, the trees painted in shades of red and gold. It was the perfect escape, the kind of weekend that Julia loved. We spent the first day exploring the woods, hiking along the trails, and breathing in the scent of pine. But all I could think about was how close Alice was, how every time she laughed, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. At one point, Julia wandered off to take photos of the scenery, leaving Alice and me behind on the trail. We walked in silence, the leaves crunching under our feet. "I've missed this," Alice said softly, breaking the silence. "Being out here with you too. It feels like old times." I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, it does," I managed to say, though the words felt hollow. Old times, when everything was simpler, before this complicated mess of feelings had taken root. We reached a small clearing by the lake, the water glistening in the late afternoon sun. Alice stopped and turned to me, her expression serious. "Max, I need to ask you something," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I froze, my heart racing. "What is it? Do you feel it too?" she asked, her eyes searching mine, filled with a mix of hope and fear. "This tension between us? Because I can't ignore it anymore." My breath hitched, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. This was the moment I had dreaded, the moment I had both longed for and feared. "Alice, I started, but the words died in my throat. How could I admit it? How could I tell her that every time I saw her, I felt like I was losing control? Before I could say anything more, we heard Julia calling for us from a distance. The spell was broken, and Alice quickly turned away, wiping her eyes. "We should go," she said, her voice shaky. As we made our way back to the cabin, the air between us felt heavier than ever. The unspoken words hung there, a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. And I knew that whatever happened next, we were standing on the edge of something that could change everything. That night, as the fire crackled in the cabin's hearth, I lay awake, unable to sleep. Julia was peacefully dozing beside me, unaware of the storm raging inside my heart. All I could think about was Alice, how close we had come to crossing a line we could never return from. I knew I had to find a way to stop this before it destroyed everything. But as I stared at the ceiling, the only thing I could feel was how desperately I wanted anything more with her. The line between what was right and what I desired was becoming harder to see, and I feared that soon it would disappear entirely. I woke up early the next morning, the cabin still shrouded in darkness. The soft sound of rain pattering against the roof filled the silence, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything was normal. Julia was still asleep beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful. I watched her for a moment, my heart aching with guilt. She had no idea of the turmoil that had taken root inside me. Trying to clear my head, I slipped out of bed and quietly made my way to the kitchen. I needed some air, some space to think. Grabbing a mug of coffee, I stepped outside onto the cabin's porch. The air was crisp and cool, the scent of wet earth hanging in the air. I stood there, watching the mist rise off the lake, trying to make sense of everything. How had I let it come to this? Alice had always been a part of our lives, but somewhere along the way, my feelings for her had grown into something I couldn't control. And now, every time I saw her, every time we spoke, I could feel the invisible thread pulling me closer to her. As if summoned by my thoughts, I heard the soft creak of the door behind me. I turned to see Alice stepping out onto the porch, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes searching mine. She looked hesitant, almost as if she wasn't sure if she should have come out. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice barely breaking the quiet of the morning. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my heart was already racing. Being alone with her, with Julia still asleep inside, felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. "I couldn't sleep," she said, wrapping her arms around herself as if to ward off the chill. "I thought some fresh air might help." I nodded, offering her a small smile. "Yeah, same here. Too many thoughts running through my mind, I guess." We stood there in silence for a moment, listening to the rain. It was peaceful, almost serene, but the tension between us was anything but. I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said yesterday on the trail. Her question that had hung in the air between us, unanswered. Did I feel it too? Of course I did. But how could I say that out loud? How could I admit to something that could shatter the life I had built with Julia? "I've been thinking," she said suddenly, her voice trembling slightly, "about what I asked you yesterday." I froze, my hands tightening around the mug. "Alice." "No, let me finish," she interrupted, her eyes pleading with me. "I can't keep pretending that everything is fine, that I don't feel this connection between us. I know it's wrong. I know it's messy. But I can't keep lying to myself." Her words hit me like a tidal wave, and I struggled to keep my composure. I wanted to tell her that I felt it too, that I couldn't stop thinking about her, dreaming about what it would be like if things were different. But Julia was still asleep just a few feet away. How could I betray her like this? "Alice, we can't," I whispered, my voice hoarse. You're her best friend, and I'm her husband. We can't do this to her." Tears welled up in Alice's eyes, but she blinked them away. "I know," she said, her voice breaking, "but it's tearing me apart, Max. I can't keep pretending that I don't care about you, that I don't want something more." I turned away, staring out at the mist over the lake, trying to control the chaos in my chest. "I don't know what to do," I confessed. "I care about you, Alice, more than I should, but I can't hurt her. I've built my life with Julia. I can't just throw that away." Alice took a step closer, her hand reaching out to touch mine. The warmth of her fingers sent a shiver through me, and I closed my eyes, trying to gather the strength to pull away. But I couldn't. Her touch was like a lifeline, something I had been desperately craving. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Maybe it doesn't have to be like that. Maybe we could find a way." Before she could finish, the cabin door creaked open again, and we both jumped back as if burned. Julia appeared in the doorway, her hair still tousled from sleep, a sleepy smile on her lips. "Good morning, you two," she said, stretching her arms above her head. "What are you doing out here so early?" I forced a smile, my heart racing. "Just couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Thought I'd enjoy the morning air." "Same here," Alice added quickly, her voice a little too bright. "Max and I were just catching up." Julia's smile widened, and she came over to kiss me on the cheek. "Well, I hope you two haven't finished all the coffee," she teased. "I could use a cup." As Julia disappeared back into the cabin, I could feel the weight of what had almost happened pressing down on me. One more second, one more touch, and I might have crossed a line I couldn't return from. I glanced at Alice, but she was staring down at the ground, her face flushed, her eyes filled with regret. For the rest of the day, we tried to pretend that nothing had happened. We hiked, we cooked, we played board games by the fire. But every time I caught Alice's eye, I could see the unspoken words hanging between us. Julia was blissfully unaware, laughing and joking as if nothing had changed. But for Alice and me, the world had shifted. That evening, after a long day of pretending, I found myself alone with Alice in the small shed by the cabin, looking for extra firewood. The air was thick with tension, the kind that had been building for weeks. As we gathered the logs, our hands brushed, and this time, neither of us pulled away. "Alice," I began, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We can't keep doing this. It's going to destroy everything." "I know," she replied, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "But it's too late, Max. I'm already in too deep." Before I could stop myself, I reached for her, pulling her into my arms. She came willingly, her face buried against my chest. I could feel her trembling, could feel the storm of emotions in her as clearly as I felt my own. For a moment, we just held each other, two people caught in a situation they couldn't control. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I tilted her chin up and kissed her. It was soft at first, hesitant, filled with all the confusion and longing we had tried to hide. But then it deepened, the dam breaking as we lost ourselves in each other. I didn't hear the footsteps behind us until it was too late. The sound of a soft gasp broke through the haze, and I pulled back, my heart dropping to my stomach. Julia was standing there in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, none of us moved. Then, without a word, Julia turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the night. I called after her, but she didn't stop. I could hear the slam of the cabin door, the sound of her car engine starting. Panic gripped me as I ran after her. But by the time I reached the driveway, she was gone, the taillights disappearing into the darkness. Alice stood behind me, tears streaming down her face. But all I could think about was the look in Julia's eyes. The pain, the betrayal. What had I done? I had destroyed everything. The silence in the cabin after Julia left was suffocating. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty driveway where her car had disappeared. The echo of the door slamming and the roar of her engine starting were all that remained. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might burst from my chest. Behind me, Alice was still standing in the shadows of the shed, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with tears. The reality of what had just happened came crashing down on both of us. We had crossed a line, one that we could never uncross. "Max!" Alice's voice was barely a whisper, thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." I turned to face her, but I couldn't find the words. What could I say? Apologies felt meaningless now. The damage had already been done. I had betrayed Julia in the worst way possible, and she had seen it with her own eyes. How could I ever undo that? "I need to find her," I finally muttered, my voice raw. Without another glance at Alice, I rushed into the cabin, searching for my phone and car keys. The living room was exactly as we had left it. A cozy fire still crackling in the hearth, the remnants of our dinner scattered across the coffee table. Everything looked normal, as if the world hadn't just come crashing down. I found my phone on the kitchen counter and dialed Julia's number with shaking hands. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again, and again, my heart sinking further each time. She wasn't picking up. I didn't know where she had gone, but I couldn't just stand here and wait. I had to find her. I had to make this right, somehow. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and bolted out the door. The rain had picked up, coming down in sheets as I drove aimlessly through the winding roads, my headlights cutting through the darkness. I called her over and over, each unanswered ring driving me closer to despair. "Julia, please, pick up," I whispered to myself, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I didn't know where to go. I had no idea where she might have fled in her pain. All I could do was drive and hope that somehow I would find her. After nearly an hour of searching, my phone buzzed with a notification. It wasn't Julia calling back, but a text message. My heart leaped with a flicker of hope, only to crash when I saw it was from Alice. "Max, please come back. I'm worried about you." I ignored the message. My focus was on Julia, on finding her, on trying to salvage what was left of our shattered marriage. But as the hours dragged on and the rain continued to pour, I realized that I had no idea where to look. The city was vast, and Julia could be anywhere. She could have gone to her sister's house, to a hotel, or just driven aimlessly, lost in her own anguish. Eventually, exhausted and defeated, I returned to the cabin. It was nearly dawn, and the rain had finally eased into a soft drizzle. I stepped inside, drenched and shivering, only to find Alice still there. She was sitting on the sofa, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. "Did you find her?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I shook my head, unable to meet her gaze. "No, she's not answering her phone. I don't know where she went." Alice covered her face with her hands, a sob escaping her lips. "This is all my fault. I never should have let things go this far." "No, Alice," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm the one who should have stopped it. I'm the one who betrayed her." We sat there in silence, the weight of our actions pressing down on us. For a moment, I thought about reaching out to her, about finding some comfort in the warmth of her embrace. But it felt wrong now, tainted. Whatever we had was built on a foundation of lies, and the reality of it was too painful to bear. "I think you should go," I said quietly, unable to look at her. "I need to be alone." Alice nodded, wiping away her tears. "I'm so sorry, Max," she whispered before grabbing her coat and walking out the door, leaving me alone in the cabin that now felt like a hollow shell. I spent the next few hours sitting on the floor by the fireplace, my mind racing with memories of Julia's laughter, of the life we had built together, of the love that I had thrown away in a single reckless moment. The weight of it was crushing, and I felt like I was drowning in regret. Then, in the midst of my despair, I heard the faint chime of my phone. It was a notification for a new email. I almost ignored it, too tired and drained to care. But when I saw that it was from Julia, my heart leapt into my throat. With shaking hands, I opened the email. It was brief, just a few sentences, but every word was like a knife to my heart. "Max, I saw everything. I can't unsee it. I don't know where I'm going, but I can't be with you anymore. I need time to think, to breathe. Don't look for me. Please, just let me go. Julia." I sank to the floor, my hands trembling as I read her words over and over. She was gone. She had left, and there was nothing I could do to bring her back. The finality of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I had lost her. I had destroyed the one thing that had ever truly mattered to me. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at my phone, the sound of the rain outside the only thing breaking the silence. All I could think about was the look in her eyes when she saw me with Alice. The pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak. I had done that to her. I had caused that pain. Days turned into weeks, but there was no word from Julia. She had vanished, just as she had said she would. Friends and family reached out, concerned about both of us, but I had no answers for them. I was a ghost of my former self, lost in the ruins of my own choices. Alice tried to contact me a few times, leaving voicemails and messages that I never answered. I couldn't bear to hear her voice, to be reminded of the betrayal that had cost me everything. I had to live with the consequences of what I had done, and it was a punishment I could barely endure. The cabin, once filled with laughter and love, now stood empty, a monument to everything I had destroyed. I would walk through its rooms, hearing echoes of Julia's laughter, her voice calling my name. But those were just memories, ghosts that I had to live with. I don't know if Julia will ever come back. I don't know if I will ever get the chance to tell her how sorry I am, how much I would give to take it all back. But I do know this. Sometimes, a single moment can change everything. A single choice can shatter lives. And now, I'm left with nothing but regret, wishing that I could turn back time to the moment before I let my heart betray everything that truly mattered. But time only moves forward, and now all I have is the echo of what could have been. a love that was real, a life that I destroyed with my own hands.